In April, we have a few shorter segments that discuss animal welfare, which entail more than attention to medicine and injuries. Today, we share the things that ensure the well being of our livestock that others may not normally consider. Welcome to Hashknife Hangouts. I'm Calen. The angry man on the other side of the screen is my co-host and father, Brandon. If you enjoy the channel, take the briefest of seconds to hit the like button or throw a comment below. I have my script in front of me, so I don't even see what his face looked like. I know he was aghast at that comment, but that's fine. As I alluded to in the intro, we have a few episodes queued up and ready to publish in mid-April of this year, 2024. And if you're interested in them, set your reminders or subscribe to the channel for notifications of when they arrive. April 2nd, April 4th, April 9th, and April 11th are the days I am referencing, and they all revolve around horse floating, sterilizing medical equipment, weight loads for horses, and rider weights for horses, respectively. That's a glimpse into our future, at it, whatever you want to call it, and a peek into today's longer discussion that I have queued up below with some bullet points. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dad.
I guess the angry man comment, give me a break. I mean, we're not working cattle right now. How could I be angry?
The squabble between you and my mother earlier was something to die for in regards to passport. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Your mom said that I used my passport. I should know where it's at because I used it when we went to Kentucky this summer. When you're talking about animal health, gosh, I mean, every time you look at an animal, um, you're always looking at them to make sure everything is okay. It's just something that becomes second nature. It's just an evaluation always. And it can be or the way they hold their head, the way their ears are. Do their eyes look dull? Do they got a snotty nose? Are they drooling? Are they hanging their head? Is there a hump in their back? Uh, have they experienced a lot of weight loss? Is their gait off a little bit when they move? Are they holding their tail off to the side or out or dropped? Are they got a lot of scours? When they're peeing and pooping, you're looking to see that that's normal. Is it too dark? Is it too light? Too runny? Is it too thick? You just do an overall evaluation on every animal you look at all the time. I mean, it just becomes something you do because you're just monitoring. And the quicker you can catch something, if there's an issue, the less invasive you have to be with your treatment. And then more often than not, the treatment causes really a non-issue on whatever you're doing. So if you can diagnose that correctly or get it stopped or get it kind of at a bay, it can be feed cause. Then it's all about causation. What's going on? What's happening here? Is there more than one animal? There's all of those things that are going on constantly. It doesn't matter whether it's horses, cows, it could be the dogs, it could be people. We kind of monitor each other and we don't even realize it because people will work around each other and go, "Oh, are you feeling okay? Something isn't quite right." And it's kind of what you're looking for. Something isn't quite right. And some's obvious and some's not so much.
Well, and I think those are all good things to talk about, and those are good points that we've already discussed. The big thing for what I was looking at is things that are beyond that, though. That's the medicine approach. That's the symptomatic, what's going on, causation, and all that, and kind of figuring out, dialing in what the ailment may be. But I think something that people don't consider as much as the animal care that's not the medicine. That's kind of what I'm alluding to.
Mm.
Things like, yeah, we talked about sterilizing medical equipment, and we'll just jump into it. Yeah, it's medical equipment, but like there's things that are more to that than just taking care of the animals through syringes, needles, stuff like that. The rider weights, making sure that you're not hurting their back, that going to the causation portion, proper tack, making sure you've got proper fitting saddles, which those are the things that they have on the docket. But we'll start with the sterilizing equipment part. Like, I think that's an important thing that people, yes, it pertains to medical, but it's also something that if you don't consider it, I'm using a dull needle. Like, first off, it's not going to be as effective as inserting the vaccine or anything else that you have for the calf or for the horse. If it's bent, it's going to be harder. Things like that, that it doesn't, it's not medicine per se, but it is the welfare of the animal to make sure that you get them the welfare that they need, the care that they need without it being a injury approach or a bandage changing.
Yeah, and I mean that's a good point. And to kind of follow up with that, with injections, for instance, I had some leftover 18 gauge needles, and they're 5/8 of an inch long, so you can get them underneath the hide or kind of into the neck of a cow, give her fall injection, and now I got these 18 gauges. I'll use them up. Well, shoot, I was bending these needles. You know,
They weren't
you
stiff
push them
enough.
in, a good sharp needle. So it went in easy, but a slight little movement and bang, that was bending off to the side. It's like,
Yeah.
God, so I'm checking these or pulling these needles off, and I know better, but then the vet, he looks at me and he goes, "You might try those 16 gauge needles." And I'm going, "Yeah, I know." And you kind of feel like an idiot, but you're not trying not to waste something, but now you're going to have to stick that animal maybe twice, or if they
Right.
pull away and it pulls out and it's bent that needle, which can happen whether the needle bends or not. So you try to be, easy on them. You just don't go slamming a needle into the neck of a cow. You kind of push it up there and then just nudge it in. And yeah, you might hit a real sensitive spot, just like on us. We've got, our nerve endings are right there on the top of our skin. Well, there's our too. Some are more sensitive than others. There's parts of your back that you can touch and you can't even feel it. There's less nerve endings there. A little known fact that I learned in college in cell biology class, but 100 years ago. But it's the same thing. You go easy and you put a little pressure and then let that needle fall into itself. Don't go slamming it in. I mean, you're going to cause that animal to push away just from the pressure, let alone, the sharpness of a needle. And now if the needle's dull and now you're having to push hard, it's time to change your needle. I mean, they don't have to be uh, going into 100 head of cattle. A good rule of thumb, I think, really is at least every other um, fill up on your syringe, change a needle. You're stopping doing
Sure.
what you're doing anyway. You change a needle. It's probably not a bad idea to do it every time, but some of these, you've got uh, depending on the dosage, you got a 50 dose vial or a 25 dose vial. 25 dose times sticking into the side of a neck and through thick hide, that'll dull a needle. Change it out. You don't have to, be so frugal that you're, trying to shoot these into them with a bullet, so don't be, don't be, thinking about your needs versus what the comfort of the cow is.
Well, and moving on to kind of sharp objects, you're talking about that already, but something such as I was thinking beyond just needles, but things that are out in the pasture that are just we've had this in the past. We've been we have been spending the last 30 years and we're pretty close to being done now of picking up just trash that happens to be out there because somebody left it. Old buckets that end up cutting them because they're playing with it because why not? We're curious and we can. Um, Equipment that's just sitting out there that's rotting,
Mhm.
old, really bad fences that are deteriorating, and so they bust open and then somebody cuts their leg, things like that. I think those are also important to keep an eye out for and take care of and address because otherwise it can lead to some of those issues that you're talking about too.
Yeah, and it's those are some maintenance things, but you're right. This whole country out here in Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, during the land giveaway, you might say, during the homesteader days, um, there's a there was a house or a shack on every 160 acres. So you can have even a small ranch like ours have a lot of different sites where homesteaders tried to make a living out here.
Right.
In You would be surprised how much trash you drag in and you the just drop over a 2 year period. So, old metal, foundations, things like that. And a lot of those are covered over. They've been destroyed, which is good. But, you'll find metal anywhere you look, especially on the corners of sections, where they didn't get too far off the corner of the section line and proved up their 160 acres, but there's trash there, garbage. What we would call garbage, is not thinking that in the sense of your household garbage, but chunks of iron, glass, things like that got away from people. And it's amazing what people do. They'll be walking along and something's in their hand and they go, okay, I don't need this anymore. And they just drop it and keep walking. I mean, that's what it seems like. So yeah, you'll find old, steel cans that have been flattened, like you said, old buckets that are no longer usable or weren't usable, you know, 50, 60, 70 years ago. We've had this place now since 1910 is when it was first homesteaded. So 113 years. And, there was a lot of activity here that first 25 for certain that after the Homestead Act, and God knows what happened. So things that have been long forgotten and sites that have been long forgotten, but still the remnants of what was done there sometimes haunt you.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think that's where people they don't consider that as well animal welfare, but when you see injuries regularly and you know that they're getting themselves into it and there's no way to get them out, the only way to do it is to just remove it. I think
Yeah.
that's in my opinion, it's considered animal welfare and true care to make sure that they're not getting into things that they shouldn't. It's like a toddler trying to keep them out of, the electrical socket and stuff like that. It's
Right.
important because otherwise it could kill them. It could get them
Yep.
hurt.
Yep. Keep them out from underneath the kitchen sink where all of the chemicals are.
Yeah.
No, and you kind of, in a way, you make it sound like it's something that happens regularly. It doesn't.
It used
But
to
you
though.
do it once, happens one time, and you kick yourself because you missed something. But yeah, it used to happen occasionally. It wasn't an everyday occurrence, but we've spent a lot of time. I'm nutty, as you know, about riding across something or driving across something, and I see it, I stop and get out and pick it up and dispose of it. I put it in the back of the pickup. I just abhor that kind of stuff laying around. And yeah, we've got some pretty clean pastures now, just because of that.
Well, and people might be curious as to one of my biggest references, and that's just outside. If you've seen any of our videos where we have the maternity pasture and we've held the mares with the colts, there used to be the L that goes around that used to be a massive car junkyard that somebody left a bunch of vehicles and scrap metal because they were always going to take care of it one day. They never did. And eventually, when we got a hold of it, that stuff got hauled away and taken away. But it literally took years to get rid of. It was not a 1 day solution. It took a long time and a lot of extra work. And again, the small stuff that was left behind, you think nuts and bolts and things that were attached and any type of clamp or anything that fell off of all that junk while it was being moved. It's all over out there. I sure if we took a metal detector, we could find more, but we've done a really good job of raking that up and collecting it
Well,
and get rid of it.
yeah, picking it up as you go along. But yeah, anything from glass to, plastic parts, tail
Yeah.
lights, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, there was about 30 cars out there that
Is that how many? It was a long time ago, so I've
yeah,
a
my
lot.
cousin, my dad's cousin brought that in, and he's kind of a wheeler dealer, always, kind of a gearhead and kind of a collector, and never seemed like he collected a lot but didn't turn it over and get rid of it. So finally it got to a point where when we bought this place, he had so much time to do it and said, come get them, or, we got to get rid of them. And he said he got a number of them and then went, okay, I don't want them anymore. So then left the rest of for us to clean up instead of him picking it up. But that's how things go sometimes.
Yeah. Moving on to some more animal care, there was a video actually, and we discussed it, and it'll be coming out in April. But floating horses, it's not really a medical procedure. It's kind of medical related. It's more animal dentistry and than
Yeah.
anything. Uh, how do you think how important that is? And kind of alluding to our conversation we had that's recorded. How important do you think that is for horses and their care and their well-being, even though it may not be, needles, bandages, stuff like that?
Yeah. It's like us. They're eating some things that are high carbo and some real high sugar things. And the added thing that they have is their teeth keep growing. So you got to be careful of that. Watch that. Depending on what they're eating, they can keep them ground down. Depending on how they chew, can keep it ground down or cause it to be worse. And when you say floating, you're not floating the horse. You're running a float or a rasp over the top of a horse's teeth to knock down the sharp edges and points to that. And it's important. A equine dentist or a vet, they like you to do those horses a couple times a year at least. Well, sometimes that's unnecessary, I
So
think.
that's job security, man.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's building a heck of a clientele. I'm all right with that too. If you had the ability to get it in somebody to follow like horseshoers or wanting you to, change those shoes every 6 weeks or get a trim and there's nothing wrong with that. That's good high maintenance. But sometimes it's not as necessary on every animal. Sometimes it is necessary, and sometimes you really gotta watch some of them, especially an older horse. Um, Sometimes the horses, as that equine dentist John was talking about, they get their jaw set out of place, and that can cause some issues too, and it can be uh, show up as a behavioral issue when you're riding or when you're training, things like that. So to get those teeth right and that jaw comes back into where it's supposed to be, can be a tremendous help. So it's again paying attention to how's your horse eating. Are they hard to put weight on? Um, do they dribble when they eat? Do they eat really slow? I mean, there's a lot of things to watch when you're trying to evaluate whether or not, those teeth need to have some attention to them. So, um, having that happen on a regular basis is not a bad idea. It's not cheap, but at the same time, if you're going to be there and have those animals and they have some value to it, you're going to put some money into them.
Uh, the other thing too that I think you alluded to real quick, but you didn't really go in depth, but they can have a drastic personality change too. Like they, growly and upset and just grumpy all the time because I mean their mouth hurts, man.
Right.
How do you feel when you have a toothache? And I think that's something that people are like, well, what's going on with my horse? Sometimes checking out their mouth, it might
Or
be
their
a good
jaw
way to
hurts.
start. Yeah.
Yeah. I know people that have had like TMJ, the temporal mandibular uh, uh, joint syndrome, and their teeth, it hurts to chew. And they get some help for that, where whatever means that they can do with through their orthodontist, or and sometimes there's some extreme measures that take place to get that corrected. But once they do, yeah, it is or can be, not always, but it can be a game changer on how they interact with other people. If you're in pain all the time, I mean, maybe you're a little short-tempered, and I just can't help it. Old guys are in pain a lot, so that's why they yell at people to stay off their lawn.
Maybe that's why you became a judge. Anyway,
Oh,
at
come on, I'm a nice guy. If I
at
had any friends,
18
you could ask them.
1830.
Yeah.
We're moving on to trimming. You also talked about horseshoes and trimming. I did not have that on the list, but I think that's an important one to talk about. Sometimes that can drastically change life, not only the lifestyle of the horse, so to speak, and their welfare, but also their life length, the how long they can live, the I don't know, the quality of it, because you had one horse, for example, that was grandpa's horse that you started doing a very specific trimming to her regularly, like you were talking about, to maintain her foot care. And suddenly that changed not only her personality and her life quality, but also her standing in the herd. She'd been dropping for a while. And then finally she came back towards the top until right before she passed away. But I just want to get your insight on trimming, shoeing, taking care of their feet in general.
Well, I mean, it's just like us. If your feet hurt, or you've got too much weight on your feet don't fit your foot gear, or you've got some malady in your with your foot, that affects everything that you do, your movement, and then that movement. Let's say you favor a foot, now you put more pressure on the other foot, and you can cause issues with that. Very typical of people who have bad knees. They get a knee replacement or a hip replacement, and they're relying on their other leg to pack the one that's not doing all of its work that it should be, and now you're putting extra wear on that other side. Same thing with horses. It can happen quite easily. And look, we're not riding cows, we're riding horses. And so we tend to trim them or put shoes on them, and we tend to do things with them that they normally wouldn't do on their own. We'll take them on some long rides, which is another issue. A sideline to that is caring for your animal. Make sure that you're not asking them to do something that is way overtaxing them for the body condition that they're in. And we've all done that. We've all pushed a horse a little too hard early in the spring, or doing something that they're not used to doing. So the same thing happens with their feet. When you uh, uh, either don't trim them correctly, or you don't trim them when they should be trimmed, some growth changes take place. You allow heels to contract. That can be painful. There's all kinds of things that they do, and they start favoring it. Yeah, then it changes how they land on that foot and how they put that foot down, which then changes how their ankles move and how their knees and how their shoulders or how they're on their hinds. All of the joints on those hind legs flare up into the pelvis, and they can make a tremendous amount of difference in the performance of that horse and the longevity of them. Knees are a big deal on a horse, especially that front end when they're packing about 60% of their weight. Um, you start hurting those knees or wearing those knees out or putting wear on them unnecessarily, you have a good chance of shortening that horse's useful lifespan, and sometimes cause them to have a painful life later on.
Well, and the other part of that is that's just the horses, but we have noticed cows in the past that have had bad feet as well. We
Mhm.
don't trim them like we've seen on some of those more viral videos on, YouTube, Facebook. I think there's some on TikTok as well. A lot of it's in English, guy out of there's a couple of them I think out of the UK somewhere, and they go through mostly dairy cows,
Yeah.
and they'll fix their feet. There's abscesses and stuff, and it's actually pretty cool to see how they can breed the hoof, fix it, and then they'll add some extra stuff on it to protect it and then get it better, and they'll come back to it in a couple weeks and reevaluate and redo any work that they need to. But um your thoughts on kind of the bovine side, since we really don't get involved with that, but we make decisions based off of it.
Yeah, well, I think the dairy industry is a little bit different than us as a cow calf operation because we don't have these animals normally up too close, only for short periods of time. Uh, when we're calving, for instance, and they'll be up in the corrals, but we don't have cement. We don't have facilities in which they're on all the time. This doesn't mean that's bad. It's just that, they get a rock up in their foot and then they're on standing on cement that can abscess or it can cause some
Yeah.
stone bruising, things like that. I mean, and that can happen in any animal. That can be out in a pasture. We don't have a lot of gravel here. We have a lot of sandstone and sand. So foot care for our animals, our cattle, is almost non-existent. And anytime you have a problem with a foot on a cow for our needs, it's genetic. I mean, they've got some problems there, and there's some breeds that are worse than others. Um, and you try to breed or avoid breeding for that problem. You see something with some bad feet, then you get rid of it. Now that can also be caused by changes of feed, overfeeding, too high of proteins in feeds. There can be you can push some of these animals, and you can see it in some of the seed stock animals, some of the bulls that you buy. They want to put some weight on these bulls, make them look good, show that natural muscle development. But in the meantime, what they're doing is sometimes pushing a little bit too hard, too high a protein, and almost get to call it almost like a founder type stage where they're just getting too much growth on them too fast, and can cause problems there. So some of them are just plain genetically predisposed to have some bad feet. And I was over looking at some bulls here a few years ago. Your brother and I flew over and looked at some bulls prior to a bull sale, and the guy's been selling bulls, raising bulls for a long time. We're sitting eating a meal after we looked at some of these animals, and I said, what do you do with these animals with bad feet? I'm just kind of looking for his perspective. And he looked at me and he says, you cut their heads off. That's how you fix that problem. You don't breed them.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah. So if they're a slaughter animal, you do not pass those genetics on. And over time, if everybody did that, then you would clean up that breed. Doesn't mean that you can't have recessive genes and you can't have some of that show up. It will, and it happens in all breeds. But trying to reduce that as much as you can. Uh, Look at it this way. It might sound cruel to do that, but you're either going to cull that animal now, make them a useful butcher animal, or you're going to use them and make them a butcher animal at a later date with perhaps a little bit of pain or discomfort that's a lifelong issue. And you
Yeah.
don't want to pass that on. So I'm completely in favor of that's some of your culling and trying to prevent it in the first place, not breed for it, but when it happens, you deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. Moving on, we'll go to again another topic that we've talked about, and it'll be queued up and ready to go, and then we're on to stuff that we haven't talked about. So, you talked about body conditions of your horses, but that also goes with, what's the amount of weight that you can load up on your horses, maybe how much they can pull if you like to drive and do any pulling competitions with them, and then of course you as the rider, your weight on the horse is just as important. What overall concept? Because again, we kind of went more into depth on it in that conversation that'll be coming up. But some of the go-to percentages you've talked about, the importance of balancing and distributing the weight, and then of course, as a rider, what's probably my safest weight to be at personally if I want to continue to enjoy riding my horse.
Well, and you can be overweight. Let's say you are uh, shooting for that 20% body weight over the overall weight or mass of your horse. You got to, let's call it for ease to figure, 1,000 pound horse, which is not a big horse, and you're wanting to hit a 200 pound mark, which is call it a 35 pound saddle, and now you can hit 165 pounds. Well, I'm actually more than that by a little bit. So but the point to this lead up is you can be a little bit overweight, have more weight on that animal, but if you are riding correctly, then you will have less effect on that animal than if you met that 20% and rode incorrectly or out of balance. And one of the things I learned years and years ago, packing was if you pack that animal correctly and you balance that load, it's going to be easier on their back than if you had somebody sitting on their saddle and riding and moving around and not paying attention to what they're doing to help that horse out. That pack animal is working less than the animal that's underneath your body. And you wouldn't think that, but you know, by the same token, get that load shifted wrong or set wrong or not balanced, and you're going to work that horse real hard too. So it's all
Yeah.
about a lot of it is about your horsemanship. Am I
Well,
really helping this horse out when I move?
and to your point, I think a great analogy to that, if anybody's been around kids for any extended period of time, or they've hung out with kids and they've been moving around with them and they throw them on their shoulders, if the kid's sitting there kind of quiet and not moving around too much, that's pretty easy to move around. Or you throw on just a regular backpack. The backpack doesn't move unless you move. It's pretty easy to move around. But as soon as that kid starts flailing and flopping around from side to side, think about how much you have to correct with your ab muscles, just your ab muscles, or maybe take an extra step or kind of shift your shoulders to fix that. That's the same concept with the horse when you are not in balance and keeping yourself in the correct positioning as well.
Right. But and to kind of add to that, when when you have a pack that is put on correctly and it's up on your shoulders where it should be instead of down around your waist, look at the difference in how that is at the end of a hike or
Right.
whatever you're having to do. It could be balanced fine, but where that's at actually on your body makes a huge difference as well. So again, you know, whether you're forward or backward on that horse, where you keep moving around on side to side, are you a nice still and helping that horse out, anticipating what they need to do to move, and then help them move. That makes an enormous difference on how that horse is going to feel and how they're going to perform and how much horse you're going to have left at the end of the day.
Yeah, and then I'll just finish up with the comment that you made earlier as well. Their body condition, obviously, that's part of the reason why a lot of the times when we're training horses, we're not too worried about when we first start riding about the length or anything like that. They're already in pretty good, so to speak, cardio condition. The big thing is the load. We're worried more about the load. And then of course, if you've got a horse that you've had around 10, 15 years, pulling them straight out of winter and going for a really long 20-mile ride probably isn't the
Yeah.
best. It's nice to
Yeah.
kind of ease yourself into it, but
Yeah, and when you're training a horse, you're starting slow anyway. So you're
yeah.
building that horse up and you're getting them into condition as you're working them. Outside of the first few times you go out on them and an extended ride, they're not used to that. But you're making those short rides, easy rides, so that conditioning kind of goes along with the training. And the longer and longer rides you have, then the better they are. But you've worked up to that point too. It isn't like taking a fresh horse that you've never done anything to, and then all of a sudden jumping on their back. And there's people that do that. We don't subscribe to that kind of um, I guess genre of training, but that's not really training either, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah. But we'll step aside with that. Maybe we'll have a more opinionated conversation about that one day coming up soon. But moving on to we're talking about riding horses, moving on to horses with their tack. I've got a couple things on here. Starting with blankets. One is riding blankets. So the what things that go underneath the saddle, and then also winter blankets. I'll see if I can try and edit in the short that I shared last year after our Arctic blast. People had a question about throwing winter blankets or cold blankets over our horses to make sure that they stayed warm. I explained why. That's a fantastic question. Thanks for asking. In South Central Montana, where we're at, we don't blanket. You can see here's Bentley, our stallion, with his two little girls that he sired this year. And they got a pretty thick coat. Let's check out our hands here. You can see he's nice and thick and soft, but letting nature do its course. We found if you let them go with a blanket, it actually tends to minimize the hair growth, and then it ends up working actually not in your favor. So we let them go just barebacked, and they made it through 20-degree below zero weather with a real feel of 50 below, and they did just fine. It wasn't comfortable, but they made it. They grow hair for a reason. It's not comfortable. We give them a little bit extra calories with the hay and everything, but I mean, there's a reason why we don't blanket our horses. If you want to, we can go into that, but I was thinking more along the riding blankets reason. So I'll just kind of toss it
Yeah.
over to you for that.
Well, the saddle blankets, I mean, I've been using the last, gosh, I don't know, 10 years or so. We used to use mohair blankets and wool blankets, and then egg crate, kind of foam come in the 70s was big and it's all about dissipation of heat and allowing that horse to sweat and uh, and do the best they can with keeping their back cool and um, mostly dry. But they're going to get wet when they move, and if you've been on them a while. So um, I've been using a type of blanket it's almost like it's a Tempur-Pedic type material on the inside, and it's got a type of cover that touches their skin that's used in some medical facilities. Actually, I mean that's are pricey blankets, but they tend to uh, conform to different shapes of the horse's back, and that's the struggle with when you're tacking up. I've got a saddle or several, but a couple of them that I like to ride more than others. And I put that on. That doesn't always naturally fit every single horse because they're not every single horse is built with the same shape and conformation. So how do you manage that? Well, you a lot of times you use a type of blanket, sometimes a shim system, sometimes there's air, sometimes there's gel. There's millions and millions of dollars that are out there and being spent on different types of blankets in order to solve some issues on some backs. So the one I happen to find, this Tempur-Pedic type of material, I didn't say it is that, but it's similar. Uh, has really helped. I mean, I've used it on a number of different horses. I've done some tests on them myself because, anybody can tell you what they want to tell you when they're selling you something. But, I reached out and I spent some money on this saddle blanket, which was significant, about 250, $275 for this thing, and used it a lot, used it on different horses. I mean, on the same trip, two different people, then getting halfway through the trip, swapping saddle blankets, seeing how their horse looked when they're like a expensive, thick felt type pad that I'm not a fan of. It can fit some horses. It does. I mean, everything can fit somebody. And didn't have a really good fit based on the sweat pattern and dry marks on that horse that this fellow was riding. So we swapped blankets, and I used mine or his blanket on my horse. So you got same horse, same saddle, same rider with a different blanket, and then come out where we were at, and the sweat patterns were swapped on those horses, and they were completely different builds. So, and that saddle blanket I was using was a really good match for that for both of those horses, even though you had different saddles, they had different shapes and were different riders. So, really, a couple of times like that, or several times, I shouldn't say just a couple, but it's an ongoing thing where you're always testing that. How does that look? What's it look like when you pull that saddle off? And um, makes a big difference on how that animal moves, their comfort. There's a lot of ill behavior in animals and horses, particularly because of poor saddle fit. And it doesn't necessarily mean the saddle itself. It means that, the blanket that's being used isn't necessarily helping that saddle fit that horse. So, the perfect world has a saddle that fits a horse perfectly. Well, in that snapshot of time, that might be so, but horses' backs change from season to season. They change over time and with age. So you do the best you can and give them the best comfort you can. If you had a chance to have the perfect saddle on the perfect horse and it fit perfectly, you don't really need much of a blanket. It's just to keep that saddle dry and clean.
Well, and that was where I wanted to head to next was saddles. How do you how do you kind of figure out the right saddle? We, like you alluded to, over time, generations, we have not just a couple saddles, we got quite a few, fortunately. Um, it's, now that I think about it in the inventory, I probably need to add to it just for, keeping my legacy in there somewhere because I got grandpa and grandpa, I got grandpa, and then I got you. Now it's about time I pony up some money and I go get a decent saddle for us. But anyway, what's what's kind of like some of them have smaller gullets and smaller spreads of the
Right.
tree. Others, like the lady, are pretty wide. How do you figure out how to kind of fit the saddle the best? I know, for example, the lady, we used that on the Parisian that I trained just because we knew he was going to have a wider back.
Right.
It made sense. We just went straight to it, didn't even try anything else. And actually, we did try, I think, the Keystone eventually, which was kind of our mid saddle, and that worked okay on him, I think. But that we looked at that and said can't go any narrower than that. So what kind of helps you figure out which one to use on what critter?
Well, I mean, you've got to look at the anatomy of the saddle, and you can do an entire clinic on a saddle fit and saddle anatomy and how they're put together
Yeah.
and all of the pieces and parts and how they interact as a whole piece, from the bars to the gullets, the forks, the cantle, um, all of it together has a form or a shape. And of course, you look at a horse and you go, well, that horse has got some high withers, really high withers. They're narrow, like that Frisian that you trained, for instance. They're a light draft horse, really, but they're thin and narrow, or he was. Uh,
He
and
was young. He was
so
2. That's why.
2 or 3 years old. Yeah, he was thin, but he was big, and so you had to be careful with him. But there's a couple of saddles you couldn't put on him because the gullet was not deep enough to accommodate his withers. So you're not going to put a saddle on somebody that you're going to make contact with and hurt them.
Right.
That's the obvious, right? So you look at that and go, okay, that's not going to work. Or you might have a saddle with too much spread or too much width on the bars for a horse that's going to not fit them, or uh, you might only fit if it's a narrow saddle. You might hit the bottom edge of your bars of the saddle and cause a pressure point. too wide, you might hit the top of those bars on their back. So you want to have that spread and that angle just right. And sometimes you don't have enough twist in the saddle, so you can put pressure on their withers and the shoulders, and where you see a typical lot of white spots on horses is because that saddle's a little bit too narrow. It's putting too much pressure on there, or they just flat been ridden too long and too much and too hard and not been given any relief. So you want to match the saddle to what that horse's back looks like, and knowing your saddle is one thing. Putting that up there and then feeling between that uh, saddle's anatomy and your horse's anatomy. Does it match? These are bridging. Um, is there too much, uh, you know, too much of a contact right in the middle of it where you've got a lot of rock to your bars, and so you're just going to push down on their horse's back and cause their back to drop and ventral flex. These are all issues. So, putting that saddle on, feeling it, getting as close as you can possibly fit, because you're not going to change. You only got so many saddles, but you got to make that as comfortable and workable as possible. Um, one of the things I see some saddle maker or saddle pad makers that have some very pricey saddles, and what they've done is they're taking material upon material upon another material and making a super thick um, saddle pad and putting that under a saddle because the saddle doesn't fit. And it's like putting on a couple extra pair of socks under your boots. Just because it's thicker doesn't mean it's cushiony. You may be pinching that horse's back. So I see those, and that's a first red flag I see. And I've had so many issues with people in clinics that have a horse with a back issue. They don't even realize it, but then once you start looking at that and kind of undo what they're doing because they think they're doing the right thing. Nobody does something to their horse thinking that they're hurting their horse. They're going to do something worse. I mean, it just is an unintended consequence. Unintended consequences, can cause bad behavior, but when you fix that, you know, then you start seeing a horse that's happy again and relaxed, and then your poor behavior tends to leave or lessen.
Moving on to, I did have spurs on here. We've hit spurs a couple of times with
Yeah.
shorter episodes, so I think I'm gonna move on. The, I'm gonna say the moral of the story for this when it comes to animal welfare, don't be ridiculous with it. Don't hurt your animal. Like those can be dangerous weapons if you choose to use them incorrectly. And I'll just leave it at that. But bits, and I would like to do a bit video because we've talked about this once, I think. Leverage. We don't like shanks because the longer the shank, the more leverage goes into the mouth and so on and so forth. It can cause pain and issue like that. Briefly, your take on bits, how to kind of approach it to make sure that the animal is taken care of, but still being able to, if you believe that the power is in the bit rather than in the horse's head, how can you apply the bit without really hurting the animal?
Well, it's all in your hands. And you can take a very, very severe bit with a long shank and say a spoon in it, and in the wrong hands can sever a tongue or cut tongues. Can be horrendous type of a weapon in a horse's mouth. But you put that in the right hands, and that horse will perform in a way that it's designed to make that horse do without hurting the horse. It's all in your hands, really. Um, so I think we'll do that one of these times. We'll have a demonstration when we change our format when the two of us are together, and kind of go through that a little bit about
Yeah.
what and why. But just know that a good example of whether or not a bit is everything about what horsemanship is about is we attend clinics. I mean, we always looking to educate. You might learn something somewhere. You have no idea where you're going to learn something. And I remember Dad being at a clinic. God, I think it was down in Gillette, Wyoming one time, and this gal was there, and she was talking about how bits were everything, and that when you take your bridle off your horse at night, you're hanging their brains on the wall. And it's like, hmm. So Dad had trained a horse that was in this clinic, And these people said, "Hey, would you ride my horse for me in this clinic? Just early spring, tune him up." He said, "Sure, why not? He knows the horse well." So dad being dad, he's riding this horse in there, and this horse had moved off leg cues for him, done really well. Took no time at all before she was moving off head cues again, or leg cues again. And so he just reached up while he's on this horse and pulled the throat latch, slipped that bit out of that horse's mouth, and just hung it on his saddle horn. So he was riding with absolutely nothing on it and just using leg cues. And that horse was doing everything he wanted it to do in this clinic. And someone asked the clinician, this woman says, "Well, what about that horse? What about the brains? Where did the brains go on that horse?" And pointed to the one that dad was riding with nothing on its head and crushed her. I mean, that her credibility went out because this horse is performing with nothing on it. You can do that. And if you can do that, why use anything? You know, more severe is not better. So kind of an illustration of the different types of philosophy that, you know, not every horse necessarily can do that. Because I've ridden horses, plenty of horses that's like, you know what? I need to be able to check this horse up, even as an older horse. Um, it's not something that you would do with that horse. Uh, he knew the horse could do that. So there is something about being able to have control, but how you manage that control is another matter as well.
Yeah. Moving on, living spaces. Anybody anybody who lives in a pigsty might say, my mental welfare is just not there. I would imagine same things kind of for a horse. Maybe, hey, I have an opportunity at catching lice or bed bugs because I didn't clean my house. Same kind of concept applies to horses and cows. So pens, stalls, pastures, the differences between the three. It's going to be more similar with pens and stalls, but
Yeah.
how do you think, and especially with us, because we don't have stalls. We just have pens, which sometimes they get muddy and soupy if we
Mhm.
get some moisture, like this last year we did. But a couple years before, didn't really get that way, except for the muck that was produced by the the heifers and the steers as they ate food and let it come out the other end. But really at that point all you do is you end up using the tractor and the bucket and you
Mhm.
scrape it all out, dump it out somewhere else, and then we spread it in the pasture to kind of help seed the ground and stuff to an extent. Kind of your thoughts behind making sure those areas, again, pens, stalls, and pastures are clean, how to clean them, the benefits of keeping them clean for the horses or the cows, dependent upon which everything they're in.
Well, you're going to get manure no matter what, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you got them up close, you got them feeding. And I think what you're talking about is in the fall we have some of our replacement heifers and then butcher steers that we feed out for people um, up close, and we wean them. And so we've got them off of the mothers for I like to go 60 days. I like to give them plenty of opportunity to gain some weight. They're on full feed, they got fresh water. Well, you're going to have a lot of manure. And so you go into like this time of year, fact is, you know, the end of December, um, uh, January, when you think back, that's when we kick those animals back out in the pasture. Well, they've been confined for about 2 months when we weaned and shipped, and now you've made sure that that cow's dried up and she's gestating with a new calf, and these guys are on feed. You're getting them used to that, some of the grass hay, and then kicking them back out. Well, 2 months worth of you know, say 20, 30 head of animals, that's a significant amount of manure to sit. And then December, end of December, January is not the best time to be cleaning your corrals because everything's froze generally. So, you know, you're going to have some idle time there till you start to calve, and you're going to bring some of those heifers in that are first time heifers, maybe some of the close calvy cows, and you may have 15, 20 head again in that corral. Well, you're going to put straw down for the or chips and we've been using a lot of big round bale straws the last few years in the corral, not in the barn, not where we're pulling calves or where we're taking care of pairs, but allowing them to stay dry. That is the biggest thing. If you can keep an animal dry, man, they can take a lot of cold. They can take a lot of, and especially calves that are newborn, getting them dried off and laying on straw and staying halfway warm. it's amazing what they can do and what they can take, and their overall welfare is way better. So they're going to be under some have some of that muck under them from the late fall, early winter from the steers and heifers, and then you're piling straw on top of that just to try to keep them off of that. And then after calving season and it warms up to where, June or so or May, it's nice to be able to pick all that up. And if you don't have a pile for it, uh, put it in a manure spreader, take it out, and fertilize some of those pastures that you've gotten, and run a harrow over it, break it up, stimulate those grass rhizomes, and hopefully you've got some better growth. So it's just kind of a cycle like that. But there's something to be said about putting some straw down. I don't care for straw because it's hard to decompose, but you know what? You got to do what you got to do, and it's the best thing you can do. And it actually decomposes fairly fast. So um, doing those things to keep those animals warm, not necessarily warm, but dry, and there it does give some insulation factor because their own body heat is being insulated. It's not providing heat; it's just preventing a lot more loss.
Yeah, and the other part too is I think we've talked about this briefly a couple times before, but you're talking about the cleanliness too of we've known people that have had foals in pens, and because they were not clean areas, nor were the foals pulled out of the area immediately upon birth. So they were left there and not taken to a cleaner pen or something immediately when they were born. They ended up having infections in their navel area
Mhm.
where the umbilical cord used to be. Uh, some of the some some of the importance of mitigating medicinal intervention can come from clean pens as well and stalls.
Yeah, not causing it in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, and I can remember. I think you might have been kind of a little guy. I was teaching a clinic at a place, and they had a new foal in their place that morning, and they had called the vet because, well, it wasn't that morning. It was a couple mornings before. The colt wasn't doing well, and took it in, and this mare and colt were in a stall that was dirty, um, which really surprised me when I saw it. It was like, you know, get these cow or these mares out if they've had a calf or a
A
foal
foal.
before. Leave them alone. You can monitor them, but leave them alone. And it's kind of the same way we've done with our feeding, because those cows will tend to calve on a feeding ground. And if you rotate that ground or where you're feeding them, they calve somewhere differently every year. You're going to have a lot less issues with the infections or a possibility of infection. So, uh, in a stall, there is no rotation on that. It is just there, and you can do a lot to prevent some of that. But wet, dirty, uh, those are the two worst conditions you can have for any newborn, whether it's a calf or a foal. And I can remember that they called that vet, and I know that vet is a really, really good horse vet. He's since retired, but he was mad. I mean, he was mad, and he gave them a talking to that was not necessarily softened by the choice of easy words. No, but they had it coming, and I didn't say anything. And he knew who we were, and I think your grandpa was there as well, and we had talked amongst ourselves because, hey, it's not our animal, but we saw what was going on, and we walked over to us and he goes, this is why some people shouldn't have foals. They think they know what's going on. They have no idea in the world what they're doing. And I mean, he just vented towards us. And what do you say? He's not wrong.
Yeah.
So, there's one thing about helping a mare out, monitoring them. There's some things you can do that you leave them alone. Um, Watch them close. We try to bring those animals up so that they're really close. And when we know they're getting close, and we monitor them all the time, but leave them out in a small pasture. Let them decide where they're going to have that foal at. And if they start to have an issue, you can get them in and you can help them. Rarely do we have to do that. Very rarely. Um, Cattle, it's the same way. but sometimes, you're getting a lot more smaller animals or younger animals that are first time mothers, in other words, heifers. They can be the stupidest things in the world, where mares are seldom do they reject those colts. It happens, but it's very, very rare. So, and part of that I think is we tend to breed them a little older and they're a little bit more mature and they kind of know what's going on. But leave them alone. Let them get out there. Let them stay clean. An animal will stay as clean as it wants to stay. Um, hogs are one of your find. If you allow them to be clean, they will be clean. You think about hogs laying in the mud. Well, why do they do that? It's because they got no sweat glands. They can't, they can only release heat through their mouth. And so they lay in cool mud to try to cool off. They're not being dirty, they're being cool. Um, you turn a pen full of pigs loose and watch what they'll do, and they will defecate in one area of a pen, and the rest will be clean. They'll be some of the cleanest animals you'll ever see.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that too, especially stallions are the same way. They'll do
Stallions, and part of that is marking their territory. They'll
right.
they'll they'll pile up poops of or piles of poop. They'll pile it in different spots. It's part of that is territorial, but yeah, they'll move and come over to add to that pile.
Yeah, and mules, I'll add. I do like mules. They'll do the same thing. They'll go to a corner and they'll drop it all in one spot.
Yeah, cows are some of your dirtiest animals if you really want to get
They're
honest
so
about it.
gross.
I mean, I'll see they're so lazy they don't want to get up and they just poop right there in their
Yeah.
bed.
Or
I
pee.
mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah. Nutrition. Last subject that I've got here. I think it's an important subject. People don't think about it. I mean, it's important with humans too, but also important with animals for various reasons. We'll start with I've got treats and dewormer that I kind of want to get to, but we've talked about this a lot actually. Just another brief synopsis. Grass, the different grasses and the nutritional value, and hay. And then, of course, you alluded to straw earlier for bedding. How about straw for sustaining and feeding?
You can use it. It's surprisingly, fact is, your mother and I just I don't know, several months ago, a couple months ago, went to a uh, presentation done by the extension service. And you know what? We've talked about that before, that they're underutilized. And so
Yeah.
we try to utilize them as well and be a little bit more proactive about learning some things, maybe changing some things. And they did some studies on just exactly that. They did one study they didn't go far enough on. I wish they had done another year because they could have saw the reproductive cycle on a herd of cows that they split into different groups of different percentages of feed. Um, Surprisingly, straw, although it doesn't have a great amount of nutritional value to it, it's got some 6 to 8, sometimes 6 to 8% on the high end of protein. So, if you need to, the whole idea is keeping those guts full and keeping that rumen full so that they can process and push that material out, whatever they eat, and be able to utilize it, particularly steers, heifers, early on in a gestation. You can get away with that, and then utilize some better feeds with higher protein towards the latter end of your gestational period, and then of course on to calving, just before they calve and after calving, because that's a huge draw on those cows.
Well, and we don't normally use alfalfa with horses, but we will with cattle.
Yeah. Yep. And for the same reason, I like grass hays. They're safer for steers, obviously, when you're feeding steers out. Um, you tend not to, or you're trying to avoid water belly, is one thing,
Yeah.
changing feeds and causing some stones in the urethra, and they can die from it. Uh, Having that, weaning time off of a cow onto some grass, on grass that they've already been eating as a calf on the side of the cow, and keeping that going, and then later on they get a little bit more age to them, a couple months after your weaning, then I'll kick them back out with the cows, and we'll feed them grass, alfalfa, grass in one bale or two bales, whatever we're feeding, half of it grass and half of it alfalfa. So you've got a lower percentage of grass protein wise, and you got your high protein in your alfalfa. And some of this alfalfa is up there around 18-20%. And it's some good high protein, which they're going to gobble that alfalfa first because it's tasty, it's palatable,
Right.
but there's only so much of it. And then you force them, they'll come back and they'll pick on that grass and they'll finish up with that. So they're able to get all of it, all of that nutrition that you want them to have at the different times. And then, towards the end of a gestational period, just before they calve, that month or so, then, we'll start kicking that protein up on those calvy cows even a little bit more, so that they've got plenty of milkability. They got a lot of growth going on with that calf. That calf is gaining a lot of weight every day. And so having those available in that protein, the good carbohydrates, you've got a good balance there of your vitamins and minerals. And we're pretty heavy to giving them everything they want mineral wise, mineral and salts, free choice. We don't skimp on that. And I think it shows. It helps a lot on the recovery, especially on some of these cows and the heifers.
The we talked about grass one time, mountain grasses being less nutritious. Then you had a neighbor in, I think it was South Dakota, North Dakota last year. We actually had, thankfully, a good amount of moisture last year, but for him, the moisture actually washed out a lot of the nutritional value. Some of the concerns with the animal welfare in terms of their nutrition when it comes to too much water.
Yeah, and I mean that was over at Belfouche, South Dakota,
Okay.
is where he had a bunch of steers, a lot of steers that he had on feed, or on grass, and it's not because it comes from the mountains or it's not mountain grass. You get a snow or a rainstorm, nearly every afternoon in the mountains, and you have a lot of growth on that grass up there because of a lot of water. So the same it's the same kind of concept, even though it was down on the grasslands. And Belfouche is a great place. It's some good cow country in there, good grass. And I saw him. I think that was in like September, must have been October. And I happened to see him in town and said, "Hey, we just BSing a little bit." And I said, "How's your grass holding out?" Because we're talking about how good the grass was this year. Got some moisture. He goes, "Oh man." He said, "It looks like Ireland over at Belfouche." He says, "Fact is," and I said, and I thought it just as he said it, I went, "Ooh, what's the weight of your steers?" And he said, "Those steers averaged 70 pounds lighter because
A
of the
lot.
excessive water." That's enormous amount of loss, 70 pounds per head. So you say he's got normally say a 650 pound steer, which is a good average, weight, really a good one if you're calving early. And now you're at 680 or 580. That's a lot of loss.
Yeah.
And so, and it's all due to the nutrition or the lack of nutrition or too much growth and the water or the grass being what we call washy, or just, a lot of water in it.
Some people like
Too
to give
lush.
treat. Yeah. Some people like to give treats to their horses. And then of course if they see special cows such as ears, uh they will get extra cookies. What are, especially when it comes to horses, what are the things to give for treats or and goodies, and what are the things not to give?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's all kinds of treats. I mean, if it's got an ability to sell and it's got a picture of a horse on it, the price gets jacked up. I mean,
Yeah.
and people will buy apple flavored treats, and I mean, you
Yeah.
name it, they'll just all kinds of stuff. So, I like just a good flat, some rolled oats, steamed rolled oats, so that you're not seeding the ground with whole oats and getting some wild oats all over the place. Steamed rolled oats, and I like to put just a pelletized type grain with some vitamin mineral mix with it, and I'll mix that 50-50 for the horses without molasses, no sweets to it. I don't want sweet feed. You start feeding a horse a lot of sweet feed, and believe it or not, over time they start getting hyper like a little kid on candy. And so I just avoid that. And we don't feed a lot of that anyway. I'll do it for a treat, as a reward, but never as a training aid, with the exception of loading into a trailer. Teaching a horse to get into a trailer then sometimes I'll use that more as a reward, but sometimes as a treat. But more often than not, they don't get it until they load into that trailer. Then I'll give them some um, as a reward. But I seldom, almost never use that as a lure or as a treat to get them to do a behavior. I do use it as a calming effect or as a reward after the fact when they've done the behavior that I've asked them to do without any kind of a lure like that. So because they can start to go get smart and like, no, I'm not doing that till you give me something.
Yeah.
And they're extremely smart that way.
Not to open this up for any stories or anything like that, but
So you want me to
what's
keep my
the
mouth shut? Is that what you're saying? No stories?
yeah, yeah, just nice and concise. What's the worst treat you've ever witnessed or worst type of treats you've ever seen?
Hmm. Probably just anything that a horse wants more of. And
Okay,
some of
that's a
those
good
are,
answer.
I
Political
mean, it
answer.
really is. It's because even horses, some horses will eat carrots, some won't. Some will eat apples, some won't.
Yeah.
And
Bananas.
usually, yeah, bananas. Usually the grain based pelletized stuff or treats that are, most horses like grain, and they get a taste for that, then they'll go for them. When we used to do this, we used to feed our horses pack horse pellets, and the large ones,
Yeah, the ones like the size
they
of your
all love them.
thumb, like the cow
Yeah,
cake.
yeah,
Yeah.
like cow cake. And I quit using that because we had a couple of horses choke on it. They're
Yeah.
gobbling that stuff because they're in competition and they want more fast. And so we had to quit using that years ago because of that. So that's a bad one. And it's only because of the treat itself, the size of the treat. Behavior wise, I think the worst thing you can do is have something in your pockets and that horse knows where it comes from. They'll want
Yeah.
more and they'll go for it on their own, even whether
We
there's something there or they imagine it is.
yeah, we knew somebody. She's since passed, but she did that. Lost her entire blouse due to that
Yep.
one time. Last thing, and it related to nutrition, more for horses rather than cows because it's dewormer. The cows don't really get anything in their mouth. I've never seen it from on our place. It's always been topical to the hide or a cattle rub that they can soak it onto themselves and rub up against. But for the horses, it's injected by poundage based off of, how much does this horse weigh? Okay. You get the little syringe full of the dewormer and you stick it in their mouth, quick shot, and it kind of some of them, I think it's apple flavored. It smells sweet, from what I can smell. Never personally tasted it, don't care to. But what's some of your insights to that when it comes to the horses?
Well, it's all based on poundage and dosage, same as you would yourself for a dog or, and we do worm the cattle a couple times a year, and then they've also got the topicals for, lice, flies, grubs, that kind of stuff. But you don't remember when we were using paste on cows as well, and you can do
No, I
that.
don't.
Yeah,
Especially because I mean the herd is bigger now than it was when I was a little kid.
yeah.
So now it would just if we did that, it would take forever and a day because you'd have to stick it in there. You know what? I take that back. I remember it now because it used to be like a big caulk gun with a little
Yeah.
L and you stick it in
Yep.
the corner of their mouth and you just
Yep.
squeeze. Yeah, never mind. I take that back. I remember that.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, you were pretty little, but and that's not a bad way to worm. There's nothing wrong with that. It's one extra step because you're doing a wormer and then you're probably putting on something on the top as well for other
Yeah.
parasites. But you don't have to use both, and you shouldn't overdose them. But one or the other, and that's a good way to rotate your type of wormer. Nothing wrong with that at all. And I've considered that the last couple of years now. Well, maybe we should use a paste wormer one of these years to rotate.
Yeah. When Calen gets home so we can use the manual labor, huh? I see where your head's at.
There you go. You got
Well
it.
played.
Yeah.
Is there anything special other than
Yeah, what
because
is
we've
it?
talked about
Not just a hat rack?
not just a
Yeah.
hair rack. We've talked about it before with the horses, like you just said, rotating, making sure they're not using the same stuff because then the parasites get immune to it to an extent. They get used to it. It kind of
Yeah, they
throws
build
them
up
for a loop.
resistance. Yep.
Yeah,
Just
resistance
like the same thing that you have resistance in with antibiotics in humans.
and
Same
flu.
way with animals. Horses, cattle, they build up resistance in with antibiotics as well as wormers.
Is there anything special though that you've looked for other than, hey, let's switch it up just a little bit, get a different?
Yeah, different manufacturers have different, little bit different percentages or differences, or active ingredient might be just a hair different. So you want to break that up so that whatever you're looking to eliminate is not building a resistance to the same thing every time. So um, some of those warmers you talked about with the horses with the apple flavor, maybe it does, maybe it might smell like it, but yeah, I'm like you. I haven't stuck any of that in my mouth. I don't plan to.
Yeah. That's it. That's animal welfare beyond medicine. That, we talked about floating horses, kind of sterilizing equipment, keeping it clean, loads and weights on horses, the proper tack for horses specifically, living areas for the critters, nutrition. That's it. That's all we got for today. So I'll
All
hand
right.
it
Yeah.
over to you.
Yeah. And that's there's much more to it. I mean, there's probably some things we've missed here.
Sure.
How you handle these animals. To me, that's part of the welfare. That is also um
The
an
stress
important part
management.
of stress management is huge. And there can be an entire portion on that. There's cattle handling clinics that are done on that as well. So we could spend probably a little time on another day doing it. But you'll just have to wait for that because uh, for now, we'll just thank you till you're better paid.